Welcome to the second part or the second track of the Internet Law and Politics Congress. Today, yes, we are going to focus on politics, and to do so, we have tried to avoid talking about technology and talking about infrastructures and so on, and we've tried to shift, along with the changes we have in the society, to shift towards the user. So today we're going to talk about politicians, we're going to talk about governments, we're going to talk about institutions, but we're going to talk about from the point of view of the user, of the citizen, how he can be engaged in the design of strategies, of different policy making, etc. To do so, in this first session we have with us Helen Margetts. Morning. She's the research director from the Oxford Internet Institute, which, for some that you don't know, I think it's one of the best or the most interesting places that is doing research about the internet right now. We are really lucky to have an agreement with them to share students, to share professors, and to share some teaching. Talking about Helen Margetts specifically, she's got quite an interesting profile. She's a mathematician, but she then shifted towards politics, and so she has, I think, best of both worlds. So she has a very technological background, very interesting one. She started coding, but then she went to try and analyze and understand what was happening on the other side of the computer, let's could say. And indeed, she did it 10 years ago. I mean, her first publication on e-government is from 1999, if I'm not wrong. So I think she can really give us not only a very intense, deep analysis and reflection, but also very broad and a very wide range of approaches. We asked her to talk about e-government on the web, government on the web, which is maybe her most important project in the last years. But she told me she has been working more about this project with the National Audit Agency at the UK, so she really can give us some more information that maybe has not been published already. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to use this because this felt a bit...
Oh. This is from the... Spanish?
Sí, pero no hay problema.
Third one. That one.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I am from the Oxford Internet Institute, which is part of the, which is a department of the University of Oxford. I'm going to talk about trends in government in general and what digital technology might mean for public management change, and government on the web in particular, and where that fits into public management change. So first I talk about the general trends, then the situation in the UK in particular this report which we did for the UK National Audit Office, and then trying to look into the future a bit and thinking about what Web 2.0 might mean for government if current trends continue. Some of what I am going to say now comes from a book that I wrote with Patrick Dunleavy from the LSE a year or so ago. This book was based on a 7-country study of basically information systems, government-industry relationships in 7 countries, Australia, the US, Japan, Canada, the Netherlands, the UK, not Spain or Catalonia, I'm afraid. But basically it was an attempt to kind of sum up what's happening to government. What is the relationship between government and digital technology in those 7 countries, and try and draw some really general conclusions. And one of the conclusions that we drew was that basically the dominant paradigm of public management reform that has been around for 20 years or so now. The kind of cohort of changes that has been called New Public Management, which I'll say a little bit about in a minute. That basically that dominant paradigm is, well, we say it is dead. It is dead to varying extents in different countries, just as it was alive to various extents in different countries. Indeed, I gave a talk in Germany, in Berlin, a few months ago, and found myself making this announcement that new public management was dead to an assembled audience, which included the new chair in New Public Management, who did not look at me perhaps very kindly. But basically, Germany is an example of where new public management was very little implemented in the years when in the UK, the US, Australia, it was being very enthusiastically pursued, and therefore there is a big time difference in the kind of reform paradigms across the two countries. But basically, within the field of public administration and public policy, among academics and practitioners alike, there are a cohort of changes that everybody has been talking about. And we believe from looking at current trends that people are going to stop talking about those changes and talk much more about the kind of changes that people here are probably already accustomed to talk about. We summarize these changes as digital era governance, and we predict that these will be dominant for the next 20 years at least. Just to summarize what new public management really was, or is, I think you can best summarize it in three key themes, which were disaggregation, breaking up large bureaucracies into agencies. This is something that took place right across the UK central government. In some cases, like the US, it to some extent happened already. The creation of many kind of very small, micro-local agencies with very specific functions. And the use of more quasi-governmental agencies to take on governmental functions. The injection of competition into bureaucracy, again, which something which was very enthusiastically pursued in the UK, also the US. Mandatory competition in many cases, mandating government departments to outsource operations or to open up public sector functions for private sector operation. Deinstitutionalization, a de-emphasis on institutions, deregulation, and a move towards introducing markets into the public sector in all wherever possible. And finally, incentivization, privatization, private finance initiatives like we said we've had in the UK, performance-related pay, incentivizing public officials to behave like private sector ones, and charging for public sector services. Perhaps of all three of these, incentivization is the theme of new public management, which is perhaps most alive, which you see most resilience in various countries at the moment. I should say that I think it would be fair to say that in the last 20 years, information technology, digital technologies, even the internet, were not really a theme of public management reform. That new public management change was not really, information technology was not there at the heart. Some people have tried to conflate conflate technology into new public management, but I think analytically it was not really part of the idea. The idea was about disaggregation, competition, incentivization, breaking up the public sector, making it more like the private sector. And there was no very major part for technology, certainly in the UK, in that plan. Just a little graph to show that in the UK at least, where these kind of initiatives were most enthusiastically pursued, we are seeing there are some figures to back up the statement of decline. These are financial obligations under the Private Finance Initiative until 2020. You can see in all sectors, defence, education, transport, everything except health, there is being a falling off of obligations under that initiative and a return to more conventional methods of procurement. So, by digital era governance, how might we sum up change in the digital era in the same way as it has been summed up so many times in the last couple of decades? I think we will see a certain amount of reintegration. New public management change left a very fragmented bureaucracy, a very fragmented government, particularly in the UK. In countries like New Zealand, for example, has had at one point around 300 agencies within the central government for a country that is about the size of a large city in many larger countries. So the setting up of new central processes, joining up, I'm not sure about here, but in the UK for the last 5 years or so, joining up has been a kind of theme of both among practitioners. And really, when they're talking about joining up, some of that is an attempt to overcome the years of fragmentation. Holism, the idea of focusing governmental processes and structures around clients, customers, citizens, one-stop processes. And in particular, the idea of co-production, of drawing citizens into government in some way to kind of do it themselves in the way, I suppose, for example, anybody who uses online banking knows that they now do many of the things that their bank used to do. I guess co-production in government would mean citizens doing some of the things that the government used to do. I'll say more about that later on. And the third theme, digitalization, moving beyond automation and putting digital technologies right at the heart of governmental processes, what in the private sector is called zero-touch processes or disintermediation, where no public agency or official has to actually, no human being has to touch a process. It's possible, for example, to now in the UK to purchase your road tax, the tax for your car, without any official actually touching the transaction. That doesn't mean it's entirely digitalized. There's still some way to go. There's quite a lot of paper involved. But no human being has actually had to mediate on that transaction. And there are many examples of that in government. So in general, I think this particular trend can lead to citizens, government doing less in two ways. One, that processes are automated or digitalized, and secondly, that citizens will do more. When I talk about these two set of trends, I'm not trying to say that this is a complete reversal of what has gone on before. I think it's important not to think about it like that. It's not a U-turn. It's more like, well, in the book we use the analogy of a yacht tacking. The basic shift of movement is towards modernization. Both new public management and digital era governance are in some sense geared at enhancing modernization or making a more modernized government. But they are more at right angles to each other. Only some elements of digital era governance mean reversing new public management, the reintegration of some processes. So the overall shift is the same, but the individual trends are somewhat different. And of course, very open to individual context or the shaping of shaping by the stakeholders in any given country. There are various scenarios, which I'll say something about in a minute, various possibilities for what can happen depending on what stance policymakers take. I'll move on a little and talk about the UK context in particular, because I think for the UK at least, and I think many other countries, before you can look into the future, you have to take a little bit account of what's actually happening in the present, and not everything that might be happening is happening. In the UK, in particular, I think it's still fair to say that electronic government lags behind e-commerce. We haven't seen the same sort of transformation of the public sector as we have of the private sector. So, for example, this is a statistic from the Oxford Internet Survey. In the last year, 46% of internet users interacted with government online. That's quite a step up. It's 7 or 8% more than the year before. But it's more. But that includes information seeking, any sort of interaction. That includes with central or local government, and it's only just over half the percentage of people, percentage of internet users who looked for or bought products or services online. So still a big difference between public and private interactions online. This report that I mentioned and I'll talk about highlights a number of weaknesses in web-based provision in the UK and a number of chances and possibilities that are missed. And in the UK, the percentage of citizens and businesses interacting with government is somewhat low in comparison with leading e-government countries across the world. For example, in 2005, the figure for the UK was 24%. Netherlands, it was 46%. And the difference for business is even greater. I'm not sure what this figure is for Spain, but I think it is probably higher than the UK, and certainly the figure for business interactions is definitely higher. Moving on to this report, this is a study that an academic team carried out for the UK National Audit Office, so it's an example of outsourcing, an example of new public management. And basically our task was to completely evaluate government on the web in the UK. We did this twice before, in 1999 and 2002. So this was a real chance to kind of get some overtime idea right from the beginning, when government first sort of set up shop on the internet, to get an idea of change over time. And one thing that I think, if anybody's interested to see this report, it is of course available on the web. And one thing that I think is that I'm proud of with this report is that we used a lot of different methods, statistical methods, a whole barrage of methods to come up with the evaluation. In a way, applying academic research to a kind of policy situation, which I think is quite unusual. Usage statistics, for example, obviously something that's very difficult to get hold of, particularly in UK government, where many policymakers, many departments do not really collect proper usage statistics or analyse usage statistics in a way that you would expect. What this shows is that you're not seeing a massive rise. These are average number of visits, and you're not seeing huge change here. Sorry, I know you maybe can't read it, but you can see that the lines are reasonably static. The one thing that there's a big change for is the pink line at the top, which is for the UK cross-governmental site. Basically, it's a portal called direct.gov. And that is a very important site in UK e-government at the moment, because the UK government are putting all the resources into that site. There is a plan to close down departmental sites and stop putting resources into departmental sites and centralise provision in this site called direct.gov. So to us that seemed a quite high-risk strategy, And a key part of this report was evaluating the kind of potential, the possibilities and the dangers of that strategy. Anyway, you can see that certainly in usage terms, it's doing well and much better than the previous portals. In fact, UK government is rather unusual in that the central portal has never had an intuitive name. The first one was called open.gov.uk, open not being an adjective normally applied to UK central government. Then we had ukonline.gov at a time when the UK government really wasn't online. And now we have direct.gov, which is a portal site which actually most citizens find quite difficult to find. It's not quite as direct as the name would suggest. And actually one of the things we did for this study was a national omnibus opinion poll where we asked people to name the central government portal, and only 2% of citizens could actually name it. Again, not quite so direct. This is a census that we carried out in 2001 and 2006, where we evaluated, where we had barrages of students looking for various features on all central government websites, and these websites, and looking at them across the central government. So the light blue is for 2006, the dark blue for 2001, really showing you know, yes, there are more websites over here in the 30, 35, 40, 45 out of 60 possible features, but not a huge change across the 5 years. It's not looking so much like transformation. Here is something we also did. We carried out a web metric analysis of the UK central government, which to my knowledge has not really been done before, although many people, as I'm sure you're all aware, have carried out various kind of network analyses and metric analyses of the internet as a whole, and some sectors in particular, like the university sector, for example, has received a lot of attention. To my knowledge, there are virtually no kind of web metric analyses of government on the web, and this is something we tried to do in this study, or tried to start to do in this study. This shows the inlinks coming into government sites in the UK. You can see there the portal direct.gov scoring pretty well, over 1 million inlinks there. And a big variation across the other sites. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office, for example, scoring very well. I mean, basically we can assume that inlinks to sites is a good thing because the more inlinks a site has, the more likely it is to come at the top of search engine results listings. So we expect that to be a reasonably good metric, some kind of surrogate for visibility. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office scoring well there. In fact, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office has objected very strongly to this direct.gov strategy where the departments are supposed to be closing down their sites. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office has argued that they have a very distinctive profile, many visitors from other countries, that they have a different profile and they shouldn't be merged into central provision, and that argument is still going on. This gives some credence to that argument, given the amount of sort of prominence they have in networks of links on the web. Some sites scoring far, far lower here. The business portal in the UK, Business Link, just with 50,000 in links there, well to the bottom of that table. Here's an attempt to measure the size of UK government. This has been a complete mystery for a long time. In fact, in the most recent e-government report in the UK, produced by the Cabinet Office, there was an attempt to say how many websites there were in UK central government. The figure given was 2,500, but I saw an earlier draft of the report which said 4,000. Basically, they don't know. And not only not knowing the number of websites, but the websites there are, knowing anyone who's tried to measure the size of a website knows that actually it's not straightforward at all. It's quite difficult, and there are many varying estimates depending on the tools you use. So this is one attempt. We crawled the whole of the whole of central government, and this is what we came up with. Basically shows, again, as you might expect, huge variation. One interesting thing here, perhaps, is right at the top we have the tax agency, Revenue and Customs, with over 120,000 pages. Very near the bottom here, you have that central government portal, direct.gov, with a very small amount of content, suggesting that if the current strategy was really to go ahead, that would involve moving all revenue and customs content to this very small site. That's why I said earlier that this looked to us like quite a high-risk strategy to move this massive, great amount of material onto what's basically currently a very small site. This is the result. We also did some experiments for this report in an experimental laboratory we've set up at the Oxford Internet Institute to start investigating how citizens interact with government, kind of in as far as possible we can simulate of the real world. This is based on the fact that it's actually very difficult to ask people. If you ask people what they do, if they wanted to find out a bit of government information, they can't. I think it's impossible to answer that question unless you give them a machine and the internet and let them go and do it. And that's basically what we did in our lab. We gave people a number of questions that required kind of information related to government to answer them, like you've just been diagnosed with diabetes, are you entitled to free prescriptions, or you live at this postcode, what is the nearest school for your 6-year-old child, what is the best school nearby for your 6-year-old child, all things where people would need to go to government and find things out. What this shows, we had basically two treatments. In one treatment, people had to go to the governmental site, which is what the government would like them to do, and in the other, they were allowed to use open search. Basically, they all used Google. That was one of our findings, was that everyone uses Google, and in fact, many of our subjects, when you asked them afterwards where they got information from, were actually conflating the idea of the internet with Google. They would say, I got it from Google. Because we also did some focus groups for non-users here, or for less frequent users, where we got them to use the internet first and then talked about it afterwards. What this shows, basically, is that in general, and it's a generalization, there are some exceptions, but for most of our questions, the cross-government site actually took citizens longer to answer questions, visiting more pages than the open search. Sorry, search has got cut off there. So, for example, we gave them a postcode and said, were they at risk of, was this particular address at risk of flooding? These subjects were from Oxford, and Oxford is currently underwater most of this last summer and looks like being underwater this summer too, so flooding is a very important issue. I understand it could be here too, unusually. And basically what the blue line says, that on the cross-government site, subjects used over 50, an average of over 15 pages to answer that. On the open search site, round about 10 pages. So some really interesting findings, I think, for e-government policy in the UK, basically finding that some things that are supposed to be easier with a central government provision are actually more difficult. When in doubt, go to Google. So overall conclusions, mostly we found government websites to be reasonably well rated by users, but the quality had really not improved that much since 2002. We're talking about 5 years between the two reports. A real emphasis on text, a real lack of innovation, and a real lack of the kind of things that you might find or expect to find on good private sector sites. Particularly a lack of anything that could loosely be described as Web 2.0. We didn't just find this in the UK. We found I mean, we're talking 2 years ago now, the situation has changed a bit. We had comparator countries which we also looked at, and we didn't find anything like the use of Web 2.0 devices in government as we did in private sector organisations. We found the UK government was actually not spending, this is the most controversial figure in this report, that the government spends £208 million on web provision. The Treasury kind of argued with this figure. They thought it was controversial that we were criticising them for spending too much. Actually, we thought they were spending too little. We thought this figure should be higher, but because it's the National Audit Office, as soon as you talk about money, the government have to argue you've said it's too much. And again, this super site strategy with the centralisation in the 2 sites, it seemed to us quite high risk. That was a key conclusion and quite out of line with other countries. I think what these conclusions suggest, perhaps, is that going back to the digital era governance trends I was talking about earlier, it's possible to see a couple of scenarios. As I said, these are not, it's not a U-turn, it's not going back on new public management, but there is also, there are dangers associated with the relationship between current change and previous change. I think it's possible to see some trends which point towards a sort of reinforcement of new public management with digital era technologies. We see some attempts towards that in the UK, plans for a massive identity database and an ID card, the idea that sort of centralised initiatives can be used to really ratchet up control in a new public management type way. And at the same time, you see a kind of risk of what we call in the book a kind of policy mess in terms of a partial sort of moves towards digital era governance, where these kind of trends cut across existing new public management trends and we get a very lagged form of implementation. How could it be better? There were a number of kind of digital era type changes that we were looking for when we did this report. And the findings of this report prompted us to try and say, well, what should be happening? What would be the right sort of culture to encourage digital era change? And here are some suggestions of that. One of them is the use of pervasive information, transaction-based information. The web gives a tremendous opportunity for organisations of any kind to really know what citizens are doing in a way that we never knew before. For example, in London, London Transport is a good example of this, where the new Oyster card system in London, for anybody who's been to London recently, you can't really go anywhere without having an Oyster card, which basically you use on buses and underground and overground trains, you use for everything, and it basically provides a map of what all citizens are doing. Nobody in the kind of London policy-making arena had a clue what people were doing before, how many people were using buses, how many people were using the underground, where they were going. The amount of data available to feed into future policy making is extraordinary. London is a really good example of that, but there are lots of examples where we find where that really isn't happening. And one of the key ones is just analysing data from websites. We found that, you know, still between a quarter and a fifth of agencies really didn't have good information about who was using their website and what they were doing. It's such a missed opportunity. And the whole kind of, we also find a very substantive percentage of agencies with no sort of channel strategy, no idea of how to shift between online provision and telephone-based provision and traditional face-to-face methods, or a real understanding, except in some departments, of the number of people who were using different channels, the percentage of their users or citizens who use their department having internet access, for example, the most basic statistics which you would expect agencies to be using. And some of the sort of moves towards kind of citizens being able to undertake government transactions or some part of government transactions for themselves, we also found to be a bit missing from UK government at least. And these are some of the things that we pointed to kind of ways that it might be overcome, or ways that future developments might incorporate. One of those, we've called it isocratic government, basically, as I said before, helping citizens to do things themselves using the web. I mean, health is a prime example of that. There are so many ways now in which citizens can find health information for themselves. Any doctor is accustomed now to seeing a patient with piles of printouts and possibly even a laptop, telling them all the things that they've already found out about what's wrong with them and how it might be treated. This kind of shift could apply right across government if it was facilitated. Going perhaps beyond that to a situation much more like we've seen in all sorts of areas of social enterprise, in the private sector, in social networking sites, in all kinds of areas of sort of Web 2.0 areas of the web, where government provides just a kind of capacity or a facility, part of a product, and citizens design their own projects using it. We're very accustomed to see that. We're so used to things like eBay now, where whole businesses have grown up using eBay, where citizens are, customers of eBay are setting up businesses relying on eBay. We could see these kind of para-organizations attaching to government agencies if these technologies were used imaginatively. But there's nothing inevitable about that, as the UK experience shows. It's not just going to happen, it has to be encouraged. I want to end just by giving, sorry, here is a diagram from the book just suggesting that that this can be the case, that basically if digital era governance really is pursued in contrast to new public management, that the level of social problem solving of citizens will increase in general in two key ways. First of all, because as I gave with the e-health example, it helps citizens to be somewhat autonomous in finding information vis-a-vis government. And secondly, because of the reduction of institutional and policy complexity which the internet and the web, which government's online presence can provide. Basically, citizens need to know a lot less about government than they needed to know before. But what might in practice this mean? I'll just give a few examples. These are some of the reasons why we worried from this report that we won't get kind of government 2.0. You're working in a slightly resistant culture here. There's very much a perception among policy officials that you know, the government web provision should be old-fashioned. It should be kind of at the back end of innovation. Government shouldn't be cool, that it was only sort of proper government if it's boring. Our site is not aimed at young people, was something we heard quite often. In fact, the Cabinet Office made us, from this experimental data I showed you, they made us remove the students because they said that's not, you know, real people. I think, and even then, when we'd removed the students, they said our cohorts were too young. Presumably young people, perhaps not totally real people as well. The idea of part-authenticated information, a lot of Web 2.0 is about user-generated content, information that's not for real. It's information we didn't have before, but we can't authenticate it. We don't know how reliable it is. That's very worrying for government organisations, this idea of part-authenticated information. Government likes the idea that people will come to it rather than this idea that they'll go onto Google and go wherever they like. One of our findings from our experiments was that over 50% of our questions were answered with non-governmental sources. Government worries about that, the idea that people would just go anywhere to find things out rather to them. This emphasis on text-based communication, many sites in the UK are planned entirely around text-based communication, for the next 10, 20 years. No recognition of the predominance that image is going to have in the future. But what could it mean? That's the point. What could be the difference there? Well, certainly it could mean a lot more audio, video, pictures in government. People are accustomed to use these sort of things in all sorts of other areas of life. Why can't there be more of this in government? I'll give some examples. Playing back information to users about how they do. How many recommender systems are there in government? How much information do citizens get about what other people do? When you do something, when you undergo some transaction with government or get some information, how often are you told what other information that you might want, or what information that other people wanted when they got that information? This kind of thing is as yet rather undeveloped. And customer segmentation, the idea of sort of working out what customers are doing and gearing provision at them, is also something that the private sector is so accustomed to do and government less accustomed. I mentioned health before. In the UK, there has for a while been a social enterprise site called Patient Opinion, where people can go and actually give their views on the sort of healthcare they've received in a hospital or from a doctor. The government viewed this with great suspicion at first, this idea that people would be able to say they didn't like the care they received in a hospital was not something that was viewed as a popular idea. There was a view that all the comments would be bad. In actual fact, Patient Opinion have received a more or less 50-50 version of good and bad comments. And now the National Health Service itself is offering a similar provision in NHS Choices, it's called, a website that, again, most of the UK population have never heard of. But, hope for the future. It's rather undeveloped, it's rather underpopulated. It doesn't really offer the possibility for people to be able to comment on other people's comments, to set up a dialogue about a hospital or consultant. But there's definitely kind of possibilities there for the future. The capacity for patients to find out information about healthcare, of course, is huge on the web, the freely available performance data. And the whole idea of hospital managers being customer-oriented is something which could really sort of flourish on the web if it was allowed to. We've had a lot of examples of kind of superbugs in hospitals in the UK, where real disasters with lots of people actually dying from the kind of infections they received in hospital, kind of allowed to go almost not unnoticed exactly. Eventually it gets picked up by the press, but only in some sense when it's a bit late. Whereas these kind of dialogues that might get going on sites like Patient Opinion are a real possibility to alert the general population to those really quickly. Information moves very fast in the Web 2.0 world. There is the Patient Opinion site, and these are people's views of the hospitals that they've been to. This kind of thing might be extended to all sorts of other areas of public sector provision. I'll move on quickly. Here's an example from the UN Refugee Agency. Here's a mashup of the Darfur crisis in Sudan. Lots of information on the ground which has been fed into by aid workers, etc., on the ground, coming together in an overall map of the area. It's not perfect. Some of this information is not authenticated. Some of it's probably wrong, but perhaps it's better than any other information that's available about the situation in that area in the world. Again, there have been a few experiments of this in the UK public sector. The BBC tried, which has a huge and in many ways innovative website, tried to produce at one point the People's Weather, to overcome the problem that quite often we are very bad at forecasting the weather in the UK. I think it's a little better here, but quite often it would be announced on the radio, you know, that it was going to rain and that it was raining, and people would look out of their windows, it's not raining. This was an attempt to overcome that problem, to allow people to make the weather themselves. There's a lot of scope for this kind of initiative. And finally, here's an example of an area which I really think is ripe for a lot of change, and that's the area of job search. This is the UK job search site, very 1.0, as it were. Employers can upload jobs, but citizens can't upload their CVs. So not so much user-generated content there. Planned entirely for text. There are no plans to allow image on there. So in general, a kind of no change situation. I mean, the web is not doing a lot for the agency Job Centre Plus in the UK in terms of bringing huge change. I think in the private sector, we've seen a lot of change which could easily transport to the public sector. Here's the well-known European site, monster.co.uk. Go onto that site and it'll not only upload a CV, it'll build a CV for you. Go onto the site and it's actually quite difficult not to start applying for jobs. I found myself almost doing so, even though I have one already. So really not a text, it's a menu-driven site, and it's very easy to see how it could go further, how you could have little video clips of yourself to show to prospective employees, a lot of possibilities there. Even further here is the site zubka.com, where employees can actually, where people looking for jobs, where the agency actually employ people to kind of act as referrers, a bit like a sort of eBay type arrangement, where people are asked to kind of half join the agency and find people and match them up with jobs using individual people's sort of knowledge about social networks to overcome some of the normal information seeking costs of an employment agency. Those are some of the possibilities which we might see for public sector job search in any country, I think, if the opportunities are taken. Finally, I just want to end by saying I think one of the things this report really showed us was some of the kind of risks of not doing these things. That's what the private sector found with digital technologies in general and the internet in particular. There was no option for airlines not to introduce online booking systems or online ticketing systems. If their competitors were doing it, they had to do it. I think government lives in a bit more of that kind of world now than it used to. That was one thing our experiments really showed. You know, people go where they want to go on the internet just as anywhere else, and where they want to go is quite possibly not to government. They will go to other places, and that can lead to a net loss of visibility for government in the online world, a kind of loss of the ability to disseminate information if people are accustomed to go to other sources. This planning for text-only communication, I think, can lead to disastrous underinvestment in government on the web. And I think it's quite dangerous to ignore young people and to in some way say that they are not kind of real people. Internet change in the online world where so many people spend so much of their time is led by young people, and we ignore that at our peril.
Suposo que deu haver-hi bastantes preguntes. El micròfon per aquí. Davant. While the mic goes on, I just wanted to ask, this is something we talked yesterday with Evan Moglen. Representative democracy was a good thing because of costs of being engaged, of information I really had to have to participate with some criteria. And this is, or not, quite a challenge to representative democracy. So why is it a challenge or not? And why should I give up on something, on someone doing this for me and be engaged.
Why should you give up? Sorry.
It's just a couple of, the question is double. One thing is, representative democracy is somehow effective or efficient. Because some people that get informed for me, they're better than I, they're professionals about policy making. And the other thing is that it has, on the other side of the same thing, is that it really had a lot of costs for me to be engaged. So why should I give up on being so comfortable, being represented by somebody else, and be engaged in providing some e-services?
Well, I think because the costs are reduced, actually. I mean, that's one thing. We have seen, for example, in the UK, one thing that the number 10 Downing Street have done, the Prime Minister's office have done, have introduced a petition site where people can petition the government online. And there are no proper figures for it yet. Well, there are figures for the petition site, but I think this has made a huge difference to the amount of people who sign a petition, because it's much easier to sign a petition, and it's much easier to communicate a petition from one person to another. So, for example, there was one of the early petitions was against the government's road pricing policy of introducing variable charges for the use of roads. There are 3 or 4 policymakers who, 1.8 million people signed that petition, and there are 3 or 4 policymakers who've gone on record as saying that that petition was influential in abandoning the road pricing policy. Well, I mean, there is a bit of a benefit for those people who might have balked at the idea of being engaged. I mean, that's not necessarily I mean, of course there are drawbacks to that situation, but I think you can see that the costs of engagement are so much lower, and the ease of collective action, the barriers to collective action, I think are dropping. That is a reason why we might expect to see more people being engaged.
Yes. After reading your book with Patrick Dunleavy, I think I was one of the things I like the most is would you show to what extent within this e-government issue private companies, ICT providers and consultancy firms are actually running a big amount of the core business of public administration. Now, if you put this together with one of the things you mentioned today, that is the co-management of public services by citizens, which could entail some kind of giving citizens part of the responsibility for the good working of public services. Now, my question is, what role should we expect for government in this, if these two tendencies grow in the future?
Well, I think, you know, somebody has to manage the contract. And that, I mean, I hope that if the book showed anything, it showed what an important part of government was managing the contract. And this is the UK's major problem, in that all the skills, all the innovation is in the private sector. The government finds it difficult to retain enough kind of capacity to actually manage the contract. And that's why we don't see much innovation. I mean, you can't innovate in this area if you don't know what's possible, or you know what might be done. And I think that is a key role for government, and a difficult one for government to undertake. I think that's difficult for government agencies. Likewise, letting citizens do more things is also difficult for government. I mean, these are both things which, in general, governmental culture sort of works against. So it means that, the government is putting itself in a position where it has to do the one thing that it's not so good at. But I don't think there's any other option really. And I mean, I think the countries that have really progressed best in this area, I mean, Canada is a nice example where, yes, they outsource a lot of electronic government, but they also retain a lot of capability within the government. If you go and talk to IBM or Electronic Data Systems in Canada, they will say very crossly, you know, our greatest competitor, it's the federal government. Do you know they're spending 1/3 of their IT budget on their own staff? They're horrified. But I mean, it sets up a kind of healthy situation in that where they're not getting the kind of provision from the public sector, from the private sector that they kind of need, then they have another option. In the UK, that's not really the case.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's an inevitable difficulty in talking to the audit office. You have to do politics without politics. But here we might try and put some of it back. First, we might take note of the fact that there is no more Microsoft-owned politician in the world than Gordon Brown, whose effect on public sector technology has been disastrous from beginning to end for a reason. UK Online was a .NET-only system that couldn't even talk to non-Microsoft browsers. Second, we should take note of the fact that every one of the sites you showed that you think of as a model of something that it would be good for government to do is running on free software. Those were all instances of free software CMS is running on top of Linux. That is to say, they were all using technology which has been essentially prohibited for use in the UK by political corruption. Third, we should point out that there's no reason to believe that the UK government is trustworthy with respect to the handling of citizen data. It is responsible for the single largest breach of data privacy in the world in the public sector, and there is no sign that it has learned any lesson whatever that would entitle it to the resumption of control of anybody's private data under any circumstances. Fourth, there's an obvious absence of concern for citizen privacy in a place which tries to take a photograph of every automobile license plate once every 24 hours everywhere on the island, and which is using the Oyster card as a personal tracking device. It does seem to me that one of the questions which ought to be asked is what the politics of all of this technology in government is. And before citizens decide to unleash technology in government, they ought to ask about the politics of it. The politics of more government services provided through the web in the UK would mean more power for Microsoft, worse technology in practice, more data for the government to lose of citizens, and more invasion of privacy. The conclusion ought to be, I don't want UK government online. I'd rather deal with Google, which, problematic as it is obviously superior in each of these respects politically to the choices that UK government affords me. In other words, I don't understand how to study this without pointing out where the politics are.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's much of what you say that I don't disagree. I mean, I agree with most of it. I mean, actually, Tesco's in the UK knows far, far more about citizens than the government. The government is actually incredibly bad at knowing very much about people. And yes, they can't be trusted about it, with it when they do, but they really don't know that much, and most of the time they can't match it together. I mean, I think the key problem is it's partly politics, but it's also incompetence. I mean, I wouldn't put it all onto politics, actually. I mean, lots of what the UK government does wrong in that respect is incompetence as much as it is politics. I mean, if you take the scheme for the national identity base and database and the national identity card, I mean, you know, one of the lead contenders for a private sector company to take over that system actually funded research arguing that it was a nightmare of a scheme and shouldn't happen. I mean, the companies themselves know that this is the wrong way to do things. If you think of the utter disaster that is the £6 billion that have been sent on centralising information in the National Health Service, you know, this is incompetence. It's not politics. They didn't think, oh, we're going to have greater control over citizens because we're going to have, for anybody who doesn't know, this is a system to create a sort of universal health record, which is completely centralised. And, I mean, in fact, it's completely misconceived because it's creating a huge system which actually, it seems, will never actually get created, but I mean, trying to create a huge system which is based on the assumption that when someone gets ill, they're likely to be at some hospital not near their home, and that they're going to need to get hold of their health records, which is actually an assumption which is A, false, and B, untested. I mean, you know, usually when you get sick, you're either near home or in another country. Most UK people don't go on holiday. I mean, you know what the weather's like. Who goes on holiday in the UK? But, I mean, you know, the system is built around that assumption. It's not, I think, a political kind of, it doesn't have political ambitions. It has kind of misplaced efficiency ambitions, and it's incompetent, and that's why it's not going to work. So, I mean, I agree with you. What you say is true. There's a lot of advantages to open source, and if you point to Australia, for example, where the government does have a sort of open source Linux policy, you know, you can see a lot of successes in that example. I agree that the good examples are from there. So you could point to that as a possible strategy. But the idea that sort of Gordon Brown is thinking about all this stuff, I don't think he's thinking about it at all.
We noticed the post office in Edinburgh having been just converted to a Microsoft installation in order to put an enormous number of jobs in the new downtown in his own parliamentary district. What do you mean he isn't thinking about it?
Well, he's not thinking about, I don't think he's thinking about...
He doesn't know what the quid is for the quo? He doesn't know what he's been paid for? Of course he knows what he's been paid for.
I don't think he's thinking about the intricacies of citizen data and...
Rebecca says you should use free software in the schools and gets overturned. When the National Health Service uses the availability of free software as a supposed bargaining tool with Microsoft, resulting precisely in the description that you've given, which is, you know, an enormous ticket for Microsoft at no advantage to the people being served. Do you think Mr. Brown doesn't know?
Yeah.
Those are political decisions made by political decision makers who have no accountability for what they're doing, because what you tell them isn't you're accountable for this. You tell them you're using too much text on the websites. Why not get blunt about it? Why not tell them what's actually wrong?
Well, I'll try to.
Hola, la meva pregunta és una mica relacionada amb el que acaba de dir el professor Moglen, i és si en analitzar les relacions del ciutadà vers l'administració... que no es tradueixen les preguntes?
No tengo...
Well, sorry, I thought that there was a translation for the questions. No, just I want to ask you, also following the subject about privacy, if you have studied or tried to study it, when the citizen addresses to any government site, if he's really concerned about privacy, and if his attitude is different when he addresses to a private site, whatever, when he's trying to buy a flight ticket, or I don't know, a booking for a hotel, or when he addresses to a government site, and if he's really aware that all his data can be stored and all the dangers that this may may cause. No, just it's if citizens are completely unconscious, or if there is a different attitude. Well, just only if you have studied a little bit the attitude of the consumer, of the citizen, when he is surfing the net. Thank you.
It varies. I mean, I think in general, yes, people are more likely to be worried about governmental use of data, but it depends enormously on how you ask the question. I mean, I think this gentleman is very worried about the use of data of the Oyster card, for example, and indeed, I don't believe it's used for tracking individual citizens. I mean, but it is. I mean, a certain amount is retained by the police, for example, to track suspects of some kind. I don't think citizens are worried about that when they see the benefits. I mean, I think when they see the benefits of it, for good or for worse, they are not so worried about it in the same way as they're not so worried about Tesco's. I mean, that's what we've observed from asking questions, but I mean, that could be an area of concern, that they are not worried about it. But yeah, there has not been overriding concern about the Oyster card, for example. There is extraordinarily little concern about CCTV cameras in the UK. It has more CCTV cameras than anywhere in the world, and there is extraordinarily little concern about it, particularly post 9/11. So there are quite strange attitudes to privacy in the UK. But of course there was a lot of concern when the HMRC managed to lose the records of everybody who claims child benefit. Yeah, of course there was a lot of concern about that. Which was incidentally because they didn't want to pay a couple of £1,000s to the contractor who, because there was no expertise within the tax agency to actually download those records without names and addresses to a disk. So they had to pay a few £1,000s to the contractor, Electronic Data Systems, and they refused to do that. They didn't want to do that. They couldn't do it themselves, and that's why the information got lost. Sorry, that's a side thing. Yeah, I mean, there are very big variations in how people view privacy. Some quite surprising things they are not worried about, and that tends to be when they see benefits from it. Although CCTV camera remains a mystery, because the benefits of CCTV cameras are, to me, a complete, I mean, I don't see the benefits.
You mentioned that a number of services are involved in co-production, that citizen users of the websites can help co-produce the services that they make use of. And I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on that, especially in more of a theoretical context, what this means then for understanding about the function of government, particularly in a democratic sense, if the assumption is that government outputs, the policies, are democratic in the sense that there's the representative process aggregates interests, and instead we see a lot of policy being substantively shaped and formed by the individual users who are developing, designing, co-producing the services that they make use of.
You mean, right, the implications for representation? Yeah. Well, basically I mean, I'm not sure what level it, but I mean, it might go to can mean quite small things. I mean, in terms of for example, a key service that government delivers is is information. I mean, we tend to forget that, and certainly in the UK, the emphasis is very much on sort of transactional service delivery. But the reason why most people interact with government is to find information. I think that's the key area where co-production is already at work. I mean, citizens aren't mucking around waiting for government to provide information. They're finding, because it does it so badly, they're finding it somewhere else. I mean, and a good use of a search engine is a sort of co-production in a way. I mean, it's producing that information for yourself, and citizens are already doing that. I think that has quite important, you know, I think basically government has to get off, get moving in terms of, if it wants to be sort of undertaking that sort of role of providing information, then it has to completely change some very long-held assumptions about how government operates. And actually, when we were doing this report, we found some quite worrying trends, such as you could talk to somebody in, I don't know, the Department of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, for example, who would say, I mean, oh, well, policy, I mean, citizens don't want policy, you know, official agencies to tell them about policy. I mean, I think government has a democratic obligation to tell people about kind of policies, policy making and policies, and that is at the centre of democratic government. But there's almost a sort of washing hands of it. Oh, people don't want to find out from us. They'll find out about it somewhere else. Well, they will. But then you have completely lost any notion of, or you can lose. I don't want to paint it as a negative thing. Basically, I think in many ways it's a good thing. But, you know, I think you need to know it's going on and account for it, you know, and account for it, because that is a very sort of deep-rooted trend. And you're not just seeing it in government. I mean, even NGOs, for example, are used to the idea that people will come to them for information. So, for example, there's an organisation called Asthma UK in the UK, which is a kind of pressure group for issues for people with asthma. Now, they're originally accustomed to the idea they build a website and then everyone comes to them and gets information about asthma. But there's around 80,000 people in the UK discussing asthma on Facebook, and they're not ever going to go to the Asthma UK website. That's true of a lot of things to do with government, I think, that these things will be discussed in other fora, and that's fine, but government won't be playing a role unless it knows that.
I want to elaborate a little bit more on Michael's question, and it was just bringing back a question that was left unanswered yesterday by Agustí. I mean, he put the question. He didn't left it unanswered. And the question is, what's the risk or what's the threat of these paragovernmental websites providing official information? So a couple of examples. One is real. A Catalan person has just translated the whole website from the European Commission, and the European Commission into Catalan, because it's not a European official language. So the European Commission has said, yes, well, this is good, but it's bad, but it's good, but it's bad. They really don't know what to do. They say maybe we're going to shut it down, maybe not. It's okay, it's in Catalan because there are 7 million Catalan people there, but it's not managed by us. So there's really a conflict on how to control this information, but how to let the co-production or the co-creation. And the example we made up yesterday, which was absolutely made up, but it could be real, is, okay, I'm going to do a mash-up between the health department and Google Maps, and put a map with all the hospitals. All, or maybe not all. So I just trust this Google map. I go there with my broken leg, and I lose all blood in the way because there's no hospital there. So whose is the responsibility? Is the website that made the mashup? Is the government that did not assess all the quality of this para-governmental website? So where's the limit? How do we cope with this?
Yeah, well, I think it is a big challenge for government, and one that government's very uncomfortable with. I mean, I think the systems that work best, I mean, but we can't use that as not a reason to do things. I mean, I think that's the thing. Yes, that's a problem. Of course it's a problem. And there has to be some provision. The state has an obligation to provide some provision of information that can be easily found when someone's, you know, losing blood and needs to find a hospital. You know, none of this changes any of that. So in a way, it's, I mean, but there are many examples where that kind of system would work perfectly well and would generate information which wasn't otherwise there. I mean, one of the examples I didn't show was an example from Swedish local government, for example, where they have involved kind of a loose network of friends and relations into kind of social care networks. So if you have a vulnerable individual, they have kind of a capacity for friends or relations to offer part authenticated indication which might be an object of concern about some vulnerable individual, for example, someone who's on regular medication and stops taking their medication. It's possible to set up a system where some individual can put in some information, you know, I'm worried that Johnny hasn't taken his medication and that he might be going off the rails. That's part authenticated information that the state didn't have before, that the state can then, you know, do something about, and if it turns out to be wrong, well, it's not a disaster. It's a question of fitting applications to the context like that and not sort of ratcheting them up or putting reliance on them where they, you know, you can't use part authenticated information for everything. And in general, the systems that have worked best are those systems that do not rely or do not rely on huge levels of kind of trust and authentication. You know, the best systems that really make use of this stuff are sort of low trust, low authentication type systems, I think. I don't know, for example, the system, you know, in London again, when they, the Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, introduced a congestion charge, everyone said it would quite impossible, it would never work because it relied on a great big system which would fail, as UK IT systems always do. But the point is, it's a very sort of low trust system. You know, you just key in your car number plate and you make a payment to enter London, and that's it. It's not sort of linked up with lots of other systems, etc., and that works out very well. But once you start to, you know, link it up with all sorts of other systems and place a sort of reliance that shouldn't be placed on that type of information, you get problems.
Okay. Yes. Well, I would like you to talk a little bit more about the dret.gov site, in the sense that it is a good example of Web 2.0 or not. For example, the participatory section, I think that is all right in comparison, for example, with Spanish government sites or Catalan government sites. And for example, in this section, I think that is a good example to follow. It's a kind of mirror for other governments. And but I know also that the UK Online, this participatory section, also was a kind of failure. So if you can talk a little bit about these two sections and to explain the different features and why one has more users and has more success and the other was kind of a problem. And also in relation with the web metrics that you have done in your study, I would like to know which kind of software has you used, or it was, I don't know, a self-made software, or was something that is in the market, or how do you use it?
The last question, it was open source. Open source nutch crawler, which was developed by one of our, you know, developed further specifically for this use by one of our researchers. Yeah, is dret.gov an example of Web 2.0? I mean, yes, it's much better than UK Online because they have thought about that. And UK Online was like a, you know, it was a kind of, I think originally UK Online, for example, had a sort of chat facility, a participatory chat facility, which was opened up, and then there were a few rude comments about the Prime Minister on it, and so they took it down. I mean, they were terrified. And I think one of the things we learnt for this report is, again, it's a case of adjusting. You have to have moderation. If you're going to have that sort of site, just for patient opinion or NHS choices or any of these things, you have to have some sort of moderation. I believe that to be the case. But you have to accept that as part of the cost of having that facility. The BBC, for example, has a bulletin board and a discussion forum for every single programme that there is, that the BBC produces. And they are used to spending a lot of money on moderation, and they adjust it from kind of, I mean, obviously, if you're thinking of a programme, there's a programme called Gardener's Question Time in the UK, an incredibly boring programme about gardening. They don't have a big problem on their discussion forum. They don't get a lot of abuse. They don't get a lot of, you know, problems with it. They don't have to spend a lot of money on moderation. CBeebies, though, you know, the facility, the online facilities for children, which all has all sorts of games and facilities to children to interact, obviously they need big-time moderation. It's a question of sort of accepting that it's needed and then scaling it for the given situation. I mean, I think the whole problem with direct.gov, the reason why I would be against that as a strategy or see it as a high-risk strategy is that it's very centralised and rather removed from the rest of government. I mean, originally it was produced by the Cabinet Office, and the Cabinet Office doesn't really know what's going on in the rest of government. So when there's a participatory section, what you're really participating with is some civil servant in a bit of government at the centre of government that doesn't really know what's going on in government. And that's a fairly superficial form of participation. Now, it had a brief period where it was moved to the Central Office for Information, which is just like a sort of press kind of media operation. And now it's in the Department of Work and Pensions, which might mean it gets a bit closer, you know, to what's actually going on, what people might really sort of care about at departmental level. So it has sort of more of a chance. But basically this kind of centralisation of provision, to me, is a very non-Web 2.0 idea, and it makes it very difficult for it to be genuinely participatory.
See, one question about how these results, especially the part on Web 2, was received by the customers of your research. I find it always very difficult to let the message go through, and I really think we have really the risk of a cool effect. Well, these applications seem cool at the first glance, but there is a need for much in-depth analysis on the real significance of this application. For example, applications like patient opinion are very interesting but are little used so far. So how were your recommendations on Web 2 received? Was it interest, and on what specifically, on what areas were considered more interesting?
Yes, well, not as well received as would have liked, no. I mean, sorry? Well, you think that's a good sign? For the research, yes, although it's difficult. It's a difficult situation. I mean, you, for example, were saying many things that are not in this report. I mean, when we did this report, we were working for the National Audit Office. We were the National Audit Office. The National Audit Office is a very particular body which is not allowed to criticise policy, which can only question sort of areas of administration. That's a trade-off. On the one hand, we were very handicapped in what we could say. And if we did try and overstep the mark, we would be restricted. On the other hand, we got a chance to say things to people who might listen that very few academics get a chance to do. of course, it doesn't stop us publishing other things, and we do, you know, all over the place, saying very different things. Yes, it wasn't well received, and when I showed that slide of a sort of Web 1.0 culture in government, that is based in large part on talks with the government about our initial report before it was don't minute this or whatever, but I mean, and before it was kind of changed, and yeah, it was less, you know, it was less strong than we would like it to be. But I mean, basically, yes, the cultural implication was, or the cultural view was, that government doesn't do things that, you know, innovative things. We were saying that government should be innovating in this area, that it was crucial that it should be innovating, and that if it didn't, you know, it was going to cause problems in all sorts of areas, and that was a very unpleasant finding. For the Cabinet Office in particular, were very defensive about that, about many of the findings of the report. I mean, there's no other. I can't. Yeah, you're right. We did the best we could in getting the message across, and I like to think that some of the, you know, findings were put quite strongly. The report went to the UK, the Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee, and this point about innovation, that you know, there were possibilities for innovation that were being missed, was made quite strongly. But yeah, there is definite resistance.
We have a second dose of Helen Margetts this afternoon, so I think now we could have some coffee, and just feel free to approach her and everything.